Hello and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I'm the co-director of the Miami, Florida European Union Center of Excellence here in Miami. And let me just welcome you on behalf of FIU and Miami and our center to this conference, Gender and Generations. As you know, this is a close collaboration with our colleagues at the EU Center in Wisconsin with Myra Marks-Ferre. We're so happy to have been able, did I mispronounce your name? No. Oh, good. Okay. I thought I had. So happy to have had this generous collaboration from Wisconsin. We at all of the EU centers, there are 10 of them across the country, and we talk all the time about collaborations. How can we work together? How can we share expertise, resources, and so forth? So this conference really represents an effort in that direction. So thanks to her most of all, and to Elizabeth Covington, who couldn't be here today from Wisconsin. I'm not going to say much in the way of framing. I'm going to leave that to Myra. But let me just say a couple of things that are more logistics. First of all, this is being recorded. Okay, which is why I'm standing up here talking into a microphone when there aren't that many of you in the audience, because I have to, okay? So we're gonna ask the same of you, and that when you speak, if you would speak into a microphone, even during the questions, because it's being recorded. I hope everyone is okay with that. That way we can obviously share what we learned today with many others. Also, by way of logistics, for those participants, please be sure that you turn in all of your documentation to either Pilar or Christine, because that's very, very important. All right, that's all I'm going to do, and then I'll turn it over right now to Myra, and then we'll start with our first panel. Thank you.
Okay, this is a very unusual workshop. I prefer workshop to conference because it's really intended to be a working group, and we're happy to include those people from FIU and the Miami area who want to be part of this exciting event with us. But really, we're looking here, and our idea here was to bring together people across disciplines with different kinds of focus to see what kinds of sparks we could set off in thinking about something that is obviously, for those of us who have worked on gender issues, a really important, critical dimension, and one that in some ways, when you look at the list of EU centers and you think about the EU in general, seems like an odd one to pick up. The EU has no formal competence in terms of family policy. Families are things that the social politics of the individual states are supposed to be about. And all of the member states of the EU, one way or another, have institutionalized policies and approaches that deal with mothers and children. And what we're doing here is thinking about how a new form of governance, the EU, intersects with a new way of thinking about what families represent, namely gender and generations, as social, historical, political relationships. If we can pull our heads out of the customary mothers and children framework and think about gender and generations as the structuring problems, structuring opportunities facing Europe, we may be able to think creatively about what kinds of issues get included here, what kinds of ways the EU is or is not contributing above and beyond any formal competence and official directives and organizing politics that it can do. This is why we chose to take a perspective that begins historically and asks, where do these kinds of issues come from? How have they been framed in the past? What is the underlying topography of concern? And what are the contemporary challenges? What comes in a way not from these roots, but seems to have developed in odd and new and different dimensions that push us to think about gender and generations differently than whatever the well-worn paths of mother and child policy may be. And then to ask still further, what about policy responses to the diversity, to the novelty, to the remaking of the idea of family that exists? What are people doing about that? What are people imagining for that? Where does the future point? And so obviously our scope here is very broad, past, present, and future. But it's also broad across disciplines. And we're very pleased, in part through this collaboration, to be able to tap Rebecca's expertise, which is more historical, my own expertise, which is more sort of social politics, Elizabeth Covington, who's also been very involved in setting this up, who is more sort of the cultural politics and cultural developments kind of brain in our triad. And we have found that we, just in talking about and thinking about who we wanted to get together and why we wanted to bring all of you here, have been learning something. And our goal is to hope that you too will learn something from each other, that you will be interacting, of course, with some people you know, but more importantly, with people you don't know, with people who are coming from other disciplines, other perspectives. And so we're encouraging you to give particular attention to the less familiar, the less well-trod from your perspective. And in that central meeting place, see what we can construct together. We don't ask any of you, we didn't ask any of you for papers in advance. And one of the reasons for that, and I know some of you were kind of baffled, like, what do you mean no papers in advance? Very crazy. We want you to come and talk, not read. And we want you to talk in a way that is also open then. We're leaving a lot of time for discussion. We're keeping your talks short. And then leaving a lot of time to discuss. We are not under a lot of time pressure. Some of you want to go a little longer. That's okay too. But if you please think about your presentations and your participations as the starting points, not the ending points of the intellectual work, and to present your work. And then we have, in each case, a discussion facilitator to add ideas, connect some of the thoughts that have been put out there, and see how we can move forward from what you have been doing yourself individually into something that connects more. So consider the discussion as important a piece of your contribution as what you have a particular allotted time to present yourself. The collective piece of this is a really important one. And so that's all I really want to stress, that everybody comes to this with an open mind, a willing ear, and a mouth that will move, not just when you're presenting your work. And I extend that invitation to all of you who are here to participate actively, not just our invited guests, but those of you who have also taken advantage of the fact that we're doing this here in sunny, warm Florida instead of icy, snowy Madison. And encourage you all to be part of this collective discovery process. So I also want to welcome you all. I think everybody here has also met Pilar and Christina, who are our administrative people. And I will now turn it back over to our first panel.
Thanks, Myra. All right, well, we're going to just move right into our first panel. which is, of course, the Historical Dimensions panel. And, you know, of course, despite all the talk of interdisciplinarity, we have 3 historians up here. But that's okay, because we're going to start by hearing from them, and then they will be able to comment on your papers, you on theirs, and so forth. So the interdisciplinarity will happen naturally over the course of the day and a half. Okay, so what we're going to have is, of course, 3 national perspectives, as I imagine, or I think, perspectives on the origins of the welfare state, its gender assumptions, and then its impact across generations. Let me just keep it brief and just go right to the formal introductions for our 3 panelists. First, we have Professor Geoff Eley, who is the Carl Port Distinguished University Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Michigan. I just said that, okay. He works in the fields of modern German and European history with interests in comparative fascism, film and history and theory, and general questions of historiography. His early works were Reshaping the German Right, Radical Nationalism and Political Change After Bismarck, and the Peculiarities of German History, jointly authored with David Blackburn, which is a kind of must-read for all PhDs in European history, of course. Among his recent books are A History of the Left in Europe, Forging Democracy, A Crooked Line from Cultural History to the History of Society, The Future of Class in History, What's Left of the Social. With Bradley Naranj, he's editing German Colonialism in a Global Age, which comes out December of 2014 by Duke. Also a new book, Nazism as Fascism, Violence, Ideology, and the Ground of Consent in Germany, 1930 to 1945, was published July 2013. And he continues working on a new study of the right in Germany, Genealogies of Nazism, Conservatives, Radical Nationalists, Fascists in Germany, 1860 to 1945. Not to mention that he's now writing a general history of 20th century Europe. Today, he's going to talk with us about Is There a New Social Contract? Generation, Capitalist Restructuring, and the Regendering of Class, 1968 to 2014. So let's have him come and give his talk. Thank you.
Well, I mean, that is the framing for what I want to say, but I'm actually going to, I thought it might be helpful to use my time to provide some framing, some conceptual framing for how to think about generation in particular. And so I'm going to use this time for some general reflections of that kind, and then I'll home in on some ways of thinking about the history of the present, which for me means really the quarter century since the turn of the 1970s, 1980s, in relation to the period that preceded it, and how generation, particularly younger generations, kind of figure in that kind of setting, okay? So I'm going to start by distinguishing between generation as a category of ordinary language, or a descriptive term in plain speech, and generation as a category of analysis with more ambitious explanatory claims. One of the problems in disentangling the usefulness of generation as a concept is that it always functions simultaneously in both ways. Generation as a social, cultural, and political postulate, so the assertion of the operative salience of a particular aspect of identity. Generation as a social, cultural, and political postulate is just as crucial to how its presumed members may or may not act as the existence of a generation as a demonstrable social fact, so a really existing social category of collective action and self-understanding. The discourse of generation, all the talk about generation, that is, all the many forms and terms developed to talk about it and how they circulate and become institutionalized, the discourse of generation is always already imbricated with definite practices some more organized and intended than others, which in our present world would include institutions like schools, universities, employment agencies, social services, and political organizations, mass-mediated representations in music, TV, film, internet, social media, along with all the associated machineries of marketing and advertising, manifold forms of governance and governmentality, subcultural and stylistic rules and practices, basic everyday ontologies of family, friendship, and sexuality, and so forth. So at every level of such practices, the effects will be ordered around many varieties of difference, among them, of course, gender. Now, this entanglement of the category of generation with the practices thought to ground and underlie it, or the sociologies thought to justify its use, is crucial. On the one hand, common outlooks and behaviors could never actually be coterminous with the existence of a generation demographically defined. And on the other hand, how exactly to bound a particular population as a generation is in any case notoriously hard to agree. It can be deceptively easy in our contemporary world to assemble a body of knowledge about generation where the latter is very straightforwardly defined, for example, as young people 15 to 25. The demographics can be described very elaborately, whether from census materials or any of the data routinely collected and archived by a variety of government departments and agencies, and supranational ones included, of course, from social survey research and polling data, from ethnographies and so forth. Historically, as we push back further in time, this naturally gets more complicated. But it's once we move from social topography and typology to questions of outlook and action that the problems arise, and generation ceases to be quite as manageable a concept. But in everyday parlance, sometimes with powerful social and political effects, which translate into dominant public assumptions or the making of public policies, in everyday parlance, generations are assumed to have some real existence organized around common experiences, common interests, common outlooks, and common behaviors. So this is where we need to say something about agency. Now, how we see ourselves as a basis for action, how we become addressed as particular kinds of publics, is neither straightforward nor fixed. We recognize ourselves variously, as citizens, as workers, as consumers, as parents, as lovers and sexual beings, as enthusiasts for sports and hobbies, as audiences for music and film, as believers in religious and other creeds, as objects of policy and surveillance, as subjects of race and nation, and so forth. And somewhere among all of that babble of interpolation is certainly our membership in and identification with particular generations. Now, this range of possible recognitions is structured by power relations of various sorts. Those recognitions are gendered by assumptions placing us as women or men. Now, this fragmentary, complex, non-fixed quality of identities or subject positions describes the place where we all live. But at different times and for different purposes, we organize this multiplicity into degrees of coherence, whether highly self-consciously or in response to invitations, promises, challenges, and threats coming from the outside, sometimes subtly and imperceptibly, sometimes brutally and aggressively, in highly authoritarian ways. Occasionally, we're moved to center our identities in extremely strong ways with conscious intent, clear visibility, and consistency over time so that one facet becomes uppermost or primary, whether as political affiliation, religious faith, sexual orientation, or something else. Furthermore, politics is usually conducted as if identities can be treated as stable and fixed in that kind of way. And the operative question then becomes, how does identity settle and congeal? How is it worked upon? How does it acquire continuity over time? How is it fashioned into concentrated, resolute, or reasonably reliable shapes? How do some forms of identity begin to coalesce into more generalized and presumed forms of collective self-recognition, while others remain inchoate or unassimilable? That is, how is agency produced? Under what circumstances, in particular places and times, can identity's non-fixity become provisionally fixed in such a way that individuals and groups can think of themselves and behave as a particular kind of collective agency, political or otherwise? How do people, in our case, members of a particular generation, find themselves shaped into acting subjects, understanding themselves in justified or possible ways? So this is the main framing conceptual point that I want to make. A generation invariably appears in public discourse as an imaginary addressee with all sorts of riders and assumptions about who does and who does not belong, who gets to set the tone, who gets to have a recognized voice, and so forth. In this sense, the history of a generation is inseparable from the history of the category. Generations make their appearance historically through a particular set of discursive claims about the social world, seeking to reorder that world in terms of themselves. Now, if I had time, it would be very interesting to chart the uses of the generation concept historiographically. And one approach would, for example, would focus on the genealogies of the idea of generation per se, by tracking the intellectual history of its uses since the era of the French Revolution, when most historians seem to agree that it begins to coalesce into its modern meaning as a collective noun to describe personal locatedness and identification. The most familiar use by historians is for the 20th century, or the familiar range of uses is, I think, for the 20th century. For instance, the lost generation, right, of the Great War, which figures prominently in most national historiographies of the earlier 20th century. In German historiography, that interest is perhaps stronger than elsewhere. One study, for example, distinguishes 11 political generations over the course of the 20th century, some of them composed simply by the rapid turnover of events in their time of youth, just a few years. In a stronger sense, where a political generation requires both sharp definition against others and a collective belief in its own cultural identity and mission, there's some agreement on the existence of 3 such generations in Germany's 20th century. In particular, the 2 youth generations of the world wars, along with the 1968ers. Now, I can say something more about this historiography in the discussion if there's interest, but in the time that's left, I want to now find some ways of marking the extreme disjunction between the context of the 1960s, so the one that produced the 1968ers, and that of the present. So if the generation of the 1968ers in the narrower sense was produced by the higher education expansion of the 1960s and the significant growth in student numbers, then the wider youth culture of the time was profoundly connected to the conditions of full employment and the growth of the consumer economy, which in most of Western Europe can be dated quite exactly, I think, to the turn of the decade, so the turn of the 50s and 60s. Moreover, not the least of the socio-cultural changes accompanying the securing of the post-war settlement during the 1950s was the normalizing of a particular passage into adulthood based on the reasonable expectation of 15, 16-year-olds of either immediate full-time industrial or white-collar employment, preferably on the basis of some kind of apprenticeship, or a deferred professional future on the basis of higher education. Now, this was an extraordinary historical departure. The social changes of the 1950s and 60s powerfully normalized a dependable structure of supports and expectations, placing young people inside a practically realizable relation to a future. So as a kind of visible horizon, even a set of reachable destinations. So what were some of the elements of this? They combined school reform, expanding and further education, the construction of the nuclear family ideal, the elaborate machinery of social services in the welfare state, discretionary spending in the consumer economy, full, regular, and secure employment, and a labor market that from the later 1950s increasingly displaced unattractive jobs onto a specifically recruited, mobile, low-waged, insecure, and unprotected Mediterranean and post-colonial reservoir of cheap and unprotected labor power. In effect, for a short moment of historical time, roughly from the early 1960s to the later 1970s, these changes enabled young people to live as though the future was predictable, reliable, and assured. The political upheavals and longer-term trends arising from the 1960s and 1970s were inseparable from this condition of possibility. Now, as a result of the capitalist restructuring of the intervening several decades, that particular normality has patently disappeared. The ability of young people to imagine a reliable future based on regularity of employment as part of an assured passage into adulthood turns out to have been the transitory accomplishment of the changes we summarize as the post-war settlement, and lasted for barely 2 decades. How exactly the experience of irregular and precarious access to or permanent exclusion from employment in the years after school, how exactly that will translate into the materials for specific forms of generational politics is one of the most important questions shaping the possible politics of the coming years, seems to me. Now, this contrast is incredibly important, and I'll close with some general remarks about the character of the political transition of the last quarter of the 20th century. Now, without going into detail, I'd argue that certain distinctive histories of urban industrial working class formation and associated politics were crucial to how the European post-war settlement after 1945 was able to work. At the core of that settlement was a class corporate or class political architecture of public languages, social policies, and state institutional arrangements that organized what was effectively a social democratic consensus. What we reasonably summarize as the Keynesianism of the post-1945 era rested upon a broadly articulated societal consensus that coalesced around the political logics of Reconstruction. The public values concerned, clustering around democracy, egalitarianism, social justice, and national independence, converged to a political common sense whose terms formed a robust template for the collective imagination. Of course, the workability of that social contract, of the social contract holding that post-war consensus together, had presupposed the politics of growth during the unprecedented post-war boom. The economics of mass production and the associated corporatist arrangements with unions linked to the prized securities of rising real wages and full employment vitally complemented the welfare states and the other social goods of universal education, subsidized housing, public employment, and redistributive taxation. amounting to a civilizing of capitalism, in Donald Sassoon's phrase, it enabled a remarkably broad consensus in the need for societal responsibilities and public goods. The normalizing of the expectation of a reliable future for youth that I described a few minutes ago was one essential part of this. Yet, this post-1945 Western European experience of relatively humanized capitalism turns out to have been a passing thing. If histories of capitalism are customarily seen as a progressive story of industrialization centered around social improvement, it becomes ever clearer that the presumed centrality of waged work in manufacturing and extractive industry has proven a transitory and not a lasting feature, one highly particular to the 150 years linking the British and Belgian industrializations to the dismantling of European manufacturing economies in the 1970s and 1980s. The socially valued forms of organized labor after 1945, still more the redistributive vision of a regulated capitalism celebrated by social democrats, stand revealed as a finite and passing achievement. At ever-accelerating pace, the social relations of work became transformed since the 1980s into the new, low-waged, semi-legal, and deregulated labor market of a mainly service-based and transnationalized economy. This generalized de-skilling, de-unionizing, de-benefiting, and denationalizing of labor via the rampant processes of metropolitan deindustrialization and global capitalist restructuring comprehensively undermined the model of corporatism around which so much of the post-war settlement was built. What we've seen since the 1970s and 80s is thus a kind of re-proletarianizing of labor. Post-war reconstruction had seemed the forecourt to an indefinitely unfolding future of economic growth, social prosperity, and social peace. Labor had won unprecedented legitimacy in the life of the state, both collectively organized and socially valued via unions, public policy, the wider common sense, and the acceptable ethics of a society's shared collective life. Yet from our vantage point now, that history appears more as a contingent interlude in the life of capitalist social formations whose ordering principles look very different once considered over the fullest span of their history between, say, the 18th century and now. From the 1970s, every element in the democratizing architecture of the post-war settlement, planning, full employment, social services for all, redistributive taxation, recognition of unions, public schooling, collectivist ideals of social improvement, a general ethic of public goods, was brought under brutally effective political attack. By the 1990s, little was left of either the practices or the principles, let alone the material structures and institutional architecture that previously organized the political common sense. The social contract binding the Keynesian welfarist synthesis together was gone. Instead, the post-communist era now brought compelling evidence of a radically stripped-down version of the labor contract. New forms of the exploitation of labor relentlessly accumulated around the expanding prevalence of minimum-waged, dequalified and de-skilled, disorganized and deregulated, semi-legal and migrant labor markets in which livelihoods are systematically stripped of precisely those forms of security and organized protection that the politics of Reconstruction has sought to instate. Now, this is the most decisive transition that the 1970s and 80s effected, and that's where I want to conclude, and I'll say something again now about generation in that regard. In some ways, the global scale of the new materialities of work, labor, and working class formation have been relatively easy to grasp in terms of the global redistribution of heavy industry, all kinds of manufacturing and factory assembly, to wherever labor costs, tax regimes, environmental regulations, labor law, health and safety oversight, policing, territorial sovereignties, and public governance are most conducive in terms of the transnationalizing of labor markets across regional, continental, and truly vast geographies of distance, in terms of a deregulated financial sector whose dominance is severed from any apparent mechanisms of accountability or relationship to productive investment, in terms of a contemporary regime of accumulation ordered around the untrammeled mobility of capital, the spectacle of consumption, and the gutting of public goods. What's still very hard to see is the kind of politics that might produce coherence and organized agency under these new conditions of global accumulation, a politics that might enable some form of renewed democratic accountability. Now, relative to the needs and logics of the now ascendant neoliberal regime of accumulation, some primary aspects of labor economics are completely intelligible. The dismantling of the older corporatist partnerships with trade unions, the deregulating of the workplace, the disorganizing of older labor solidarities, and the freeing of labor power for purposes of more effective exploitation. All of these things make complete sense in neoliberal terms. In those terms, from the standpoint of capital, both the higher levels of women's recruitment into labor markets and the massive reliance on migrancy and migration make self-evidently good sense. For the same purposes, the state's connivance at the same goals can also be made very intelligible. But what possible rationality can there be, socially, politically, economically, for the systematic abandonment of youth? What is the intelligibility here? You know, there was an article in The Guardian about a week ago from some latest reporting some latest findings of social survey evidence about the degree to which young people, young adults, actually middle-aged adults, are still living in their family homes. And there's some evidence that it's diminishing a little recently in Britain, I think the Netherlands and somewhere else. But everywhere else, people are like not escaping into that anticipated future that I described a bit earlier on as being a distinctive feature of the 1950s, produced by the 1950s and 1960s. So what's the possible intelligibility, either from the point of view of capital or the point of view of government, of allowing this to continue? It's very, very strange, it seems to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Very much. Next up, we have Professor Camille Robcis, who is an assistant professor in the history department at Cornell University. Her first book, The Law of Kinship, Anthropology, Psychoanalysis, and the Family in France, which came out in 2013 by Cornell, examines how French policymakers have called upon structuralist anthropology and psychoanalysis, specifically Claude Lévi-Strauss and Jacques Lacan, to reassert the centrality of sexual difference as the foundation for all social and psychic organization. More broadly, her research and teaching interests have focused on the historical construction of norms, the intellectual production of knowledge, and the articulation of gender and sexuality in the social sciences, and particularly in psychoanalysis. Really cool stuff, I think. The paper that she's going to give us today is entitled Family Policy and Origins of the Welfare State in France. Thank you.
Thank you. So first I want to thank all the organizers for inviting me to this, and Rebecca for putting together this excellent historical panel, and Christina and Pilar for making everything seem so smooth. So what I'm going to do today is I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the family in social policy in France, but I'm going to begin with the present, and then I'll get to the history. And in particular, I wanted to talk to you about something that you might have seen in the news that's been raging in France in the last couple of months, is the protests against this gay marriage law that the French government was trying to pass. So on November 7th, 2012, Christiane Taubira, the Minister of Justice of the recently elected government of François Hollande, presented the first version of a bill that would eventually be known as the Mariage pour tous, or Marriage for All. The law was designed to comply with one of Hollande's campaign promises to open marriage and adoption to same-sex couples, a seemingly uncontroversial proposition that, according to surveys, was backed up by 2/3 of the French population. The bill proposed to keep the current marriage and adoption law intact and to simply include same-sex couples, thus replacing the terms of husband and wife with that of spouse and father and mother with parent. The Marriage for All bill unleashed a series of massive street protests throughout France, with some reaching 300,000 to 500,000 participants, depending on the sources. And even though the law was voted in May of 2013, and this is after several months of really heated debates in the Senate, the Assembly, and the courts and the media, the protesters continue up to now, basically. So I'll show you a few slides of the protest, and I want you in particular to pay attention to two things, because that's sort of what I'm going to talk about. The first thing is the centrality of reproduction in the debates. The law was actually a law about marriage. It was called Marriage for All. And there was a clause that would allow same-sex couples to adopt children. But one of the very controversial issues with this law is that it didn't open access to reproductive technologies to same-sex couples or to surrogacy. Surrogacy is still banned in France for all heterosexual or homosexual couples. And reproductive technologies are open only if you are heterosexual and married, for complicated reasons that I can return to. So the centrality of reproduction in the debates is one thing I want you guys to focus on. And the second thing is the connection between traditional Republican imagery and the heterosexual family. So this will make sense in a second. So these are the pictures of the protest. This is a Champ de Mars, so you can to show you the numbers. These are their flags. So this was called the Manif pour tous. Again, more to say about this, but the title is a kind of a embrace of the Republican universalism rhetoric of the Mariage pour tous, and they're called the Manif pour tous. It says all born from a man and a woman. So these are these Mariannes. So they're these women who were who were protesting the gay marriage law. They're dressed as Mariannes with the cap, and they are holding the civil code. So two symbols of French republicanism, right? And you see the poster said "Made in Papa and Maman." All safekeepers of the civil code. So again, this obsession with what this was going to do to the civil code. A lot of strategies, like recuperating strategies from the left. So protest, here lies French democracy. The manifesto of the Manif pour tous, which is exactly modeled on the call from the General de Gaulle, call to the resistance. So a lot of the images of the resistance, again, a kind of classic Republican trope. You see it's even the same font, the same... this is a group called the Printemps Français that thought that the Manif pour tous was too soft, and they decided. So their symbols were people like Gandhi, the Berlin Wall, Solidarność, so nothing to do. But this idea that basically the minute that you're touching on marriage, you're touching to something intrinsic to democracy, right? And this is somehow gay marriage is affiliated with totalitarianism. This also comes up in the images you see in this picture. For example, Hollande walking next to Hitler and Stalin, right? So that there's something about gay marriage that was essentially is totalitarian in its nature. So these are again some of one of these groups called the Omen. So they're the Omen is marrying. So they were protesting gay marriage. You see how they're recuperating Jean Moulin, the resistance hero, and the Delacroix painting, of course. No to dictatorship. So again, you see the kind of Republican. I'm going through these sort of quickly because I want to get to the history, but. This is the image I was mentioning. Rest in peace, the French Republic. So these are the posters, which again, a lot of them take up images from May 68, so the kind of reappropriation of the left, stop to familiphobia. Families are sites of solidarity, the future of the republic, so this kind of relationship between family and solidarity, you know, the despising of democracy, this idea that you're touching on something intrinsic to democracy. Together for the common good. And the other one says, you know, the other one has a kind of crazy list of what could happen. So the fictitious filiation, fabrication of children, mercantilization of bodies, ideology of gender, police repression, fiscal persecution, confiscated democracy, right? But again, I'm interested in the kind of logic that this is how what you get to. And the focus on reproduction. So no PMI's reproductive technologies, GPI's surrogacy. And again, none of this was mentioned in the law, but this idea of that this was going to happen. These are the May 68 posters I was mentioning. So again, like a lot of focus on children, on filiation, on what that was going to do. This is actually, for those of you who remember, who were in France in the 80s, it's modeled on the Touche pas mon pote, which was the SOS Racisme, the anti-racist campaign. So this is a Don't Touch Filiation. More no to fiction filiation, anonymous father, anonymous mothers. Okay, so so what does this all mean? Okay, so so how do we understand this? So one way to understand this is to basically interpret the proliferation of references to reproductive technologies and to surrogacy in the posters and in the rhetoric of the protesters as a kind of slippery slope argument, right? That if we allow adoption, it will lead to the opening of procreative technologies, to polygamy, to incest, to the eradication of all norms and limits. And this is certainly the logic that has informed many other opponents to gay marriage throughout the world. And I'm thinking here of someone like Antonin Scalia's objection in Lawrence v. Texas, the idea that if anti-sodomy was ruled unconstitutional, state laws against bigamy, same-sex marriage, adult incest, prostitution, masturbation, etc., would all be called into question. But if we look back at the history of family policy in France and in its relationship to welfare and to republicanism, I think there's a more interesting connection that emerges. And this is sort of what I tried to explore in my book. And my book came out last May, and basically all this stuff started happening. Sometimes you finish a book and then you realize I was actually right. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about what I mentioned in the book about familialism, and so hopefully it can illuminate some of these protests, so it doesn't just look completely crazy from this side of the Atlantic. And basically, one of the things I argue in the book is that the family was not just important for French political culture, but rather that it has been constructed as constitutive of the social, and this is important in the sense that there was no social if there was no family. So this is why all these references to the social keep on coming up. And I refer to this movement as familialism. And for a country that's been so obsessed with thinking the social, at least since 1789, this is a big deal. So before getting into the details of how familialism emerged and how it operated historically, I want to highlight two of its features. The two things that I found most sort of shocking when I was researching the history of family policy in France. The first is the longevity of family policy, and pretty much the remarkable continuity from the 1930s to the 1960s. And of course, when you say 1930s to 1960s, you have Vichy in the middle and the liberation. And what's amazing is that everybody from the right to the left supported family policy. And so, names shifted, personnel shifted, but essentially much of the structures remained the same throughout this time. The second thing is France's degree of commitment to family policy. France was the first country to adopt an extensive system of family allowances, followed only by the three fascist states, Germany, Italy, and Spain, who modeled their family policies on the French example. And some historians, such as, I'm thinking here of Victoria de Grazia, for example, have suggested that fascist law never proposed to meddle in family affairs to the degree that France's 1939 family code did, which I'll discuss in a second. Furthermore, by the time that other European countries had implemented family allowances after the Second World War, France still had the most generous set of benefits, which by then had been incorporated into the Social Security plan. So my argument here is that basically the success and singularity of French family policy can be attributed to these two main factors. First, to the longue durée construction of the family as the solution to the social question. And this is very important because it was basically what convinced elected officials across the political spectrum to endorse a strong family policy. And you see this in the images, right? That if you go against the family, you're somehow going against the social, against the republic also. And second, that the particularly dramatic French demographic context at the end of the 19th century, and more important, the all-encompassing discourse around depopulation, were instrumental in pushing the 1939 Family Code into existence and in explaining the continued interest in the family after World War II. Okay, so first I'll talk about familialism in the law, and then about familialism in social policy. So familialism in the law, the problem of the social bond framed the composition of the 1804 Civil Code, written only a few years after the end of the Terror. And the idea here was that, the revolution had broken all bonds and thus unleashed passions that had basically culminated in the Terror. And so the architects of the Civil Code emphasized the importance of developing new framing mechanisms for individuals. And the two framing mechanisms, of course, that they set up were property and the family, which, of course, were tied. And this was also Napoleon's project. So to try to think, to try to revalorize the family as what was going to keep the social together. So this is a quote from Portalis, one of the main writers of the Civil Code. Our goal has been to tie mores to laws and to propagate the spirit of the family, which is so favorable to the civil spirit. Private virtues alone can guarantee public virtues, and it is through this small homeland, the family, that we tie ourselves to the great one. Only good fathers, good husbands, and good sons make good citizens. The role of civil institutions is to sanction and protect all the honest affections of nature. Right? So this idea that if you don't have the family, you can't have access to the social, to the whole. And what's interesting here, and again, if the work of Suzanne Descent is very helpful on this particular point, is that unlike the revolutionaries whose reforms of family law were guided by the idea of the laws of nature, right, this obsession with natural law, there was nothing natural about the family and marriage as conceived by Napoleon and the Code. Marriage was a social contract that had nothing to do with physical attraction. Children were considered legitimate if a father and a mother were married at the time of conception. And this is where Napoleon famously said that he didn't care about concubines and bastards, right? So it was the fiction that counted much more than the practices. The Civil Code's definitions of marriage and filiation were surprisingly uncontested, and even some of the most liberal thinkers, like, for example, Benjamin Constant, who was all about kind of, individual liberties, thought that this was a good thing, that the state had something to say about marriage and filiation, which is why one of the posters you might remember said, "No to non à la filiation fiction, no to filiation fiction," which is actually really funny because the whole French system of filiation is a fiction, right? It's based on. Okay, so how did this work out in terms of public policy? So this is the second part. So despite the central role of the family in the Civil Code, many family activists in the 19th century and in the early 20th century thought that it didn't do enough to promote large families. This was the argument of the sociologist Frédéric Leplay throughout the second half of the 19th century, an argument that was enhanced by France's demographic crisis during those years. So this is, again, some of you might know this, but basically the French, for reasons that demographers have not yet fully explained, this is my attempt to do numbers, there was a very low birth rate in France, basically from the 1850s to World War II. So although the French birth rate had been on a steady decline since the 1850s, it was not until the 1880s that a series of alarming and highly publicized census reports revealed the extent of France's population crisis. France was not the only European country with a falling birth rate, but it was a particular source of political anxiety in France. And France's demographic situation worsened from 1890 to 1939 and then the people at the time said that the numbers of deaths exceeded the numbers of births, or to quote the famous expression of the time, as the coffins outnumbered the cribs. So this meant that basically the population was no longer renewing itself. During these years, depopulation emerged as one of the most powerful keywords for domestic and foreign policy. In the field of foreign policy, depopulation justified France's colonial missions. Similarly, it offered an attractive explanation for the military humiliation in the 1870 war against Prussia, which had resulted in the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. In fact, until World War II, most discussions of the German threat, quote, involved a reminder of the numerical superiority of the German population and army. But of course, France's depopulation crisis was not strictly a problem of numbers. As many historians have suggested, depopulation served as an umbrella term to cover many of the most pressing political, social, and cultural questions of the Third Republic. And, you know, again, historians have worked on this, but it goes anything from nationalism, feminism, the women question, neo-Malthusianism, the spread of contraceptive technologies, the promotion of a new republican morality, and the ideological war against the church. All of that were somehow related to depopulation. Thus, while the familialist movement in France claimed that family policy was the solution to the depopulation problem, it also said that the family could solve all of these issues, right? That somehow if you could have a strong family policy, you would resolve all these other questions that were linked to this. So the most important and influential actors of early French familialism can be divided into two groups. The first were the natalistes or pronatalists, for whom the prime political battle was to stop depopulation by increasing the birth rate and fighting contraception, abortion, and any other methods designed to limit the birth. So these are some of the kind of pronatalist propaganda. So some of the things they wanted specific, they had in mind very specific legislative moves. One of them was the family vote, which is actually really interesting because it was the idea that each male head of household would get the number of votes corresponding to his wives and his children. But again, that was advocated with the rhetoric of universalism. That was the true universal vote, right? And of course, remember that there's no women's vote at the time. And so women's vote in this context is considered the kind of selfish way to go about it. And this would be the really true universalist way to get, again, with France's rhetoric of Republican universalism, this is important. And, of course, the thing about these movements is that, even though they claim to be purely motivated by numbers, there was always a social message behind, and, a particular configuration of sex and gender. So, for example, of course, stay-at-home mothers were being promoted. This is posters showing why big families are important. So one of the other things they wanted, for example, was tax breaks for large families. So very concrete propositions. This is again a poster from. So the mother who stays at home is a better worker, more noble basically, and more indispensable of all, right? Okay. The second group were the social Catholics, the familiaux. And here it was much more of a defense of large families, familles nombreuses, and who would be raised according to the precepts of the Church, and more specifically, the 1891 encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. And again, you might remember that Rerum Novarum had a kind of condemnation of both industrialism because of the kind of social alienation that was brought about by industrialism, but also of socialism. So that that these were the two kind of ills, and that the Church could capitalize on the social disarray and indirectly regain some of its prestige lost during the 19th century by encouraging employers and protect workers. And basically give them better wages, but to do this by promoting specific family allowances. So this is actually the beginning of family allowances in France. The first system of family benefits were set up by Catholic industrialists. So maternity benefits, benefits for the first child, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting about this is that none of these arguments by the French familialists were made on religious grounds. So it was all made on the sense of, it was again this rhetoric of the social, right? That what we're interested in is a kind of a social coherence, not, to convert them explicitly. So the last part, how did this actually make it into the state? Well, it made it into the state through two vectors. One administrative body, the Haut Comité de la Population, and one text called the Code de la Famille, the Family Code. So because of the structural and ideological efforts of pro-family lobbyists at the turn of the century, the French state became very much involved in family affairs by the 1930s. World War I, and particularly the 1.4 million deaths, intensified the rhetoric of depopulation, persuading elected officials to make family policy a national priority. Moreover, France's cultural and social changes during this period, which produced a general anxiety around gender and sexuality, legitimated a familialist discourse that proposed to revalorize the family and traditional gender roles. Family activists organized national meetings, these were called Congrès de Natalité, and lobby groups within the assembly. And basically, all of these lobby efforts finally convinced the president of the Conseil, Édouard Daladier, who actually had just returned from Munich, so this was a good time to do this in 1939, to create this organization, the Haut Comité de la Population. And the Haut Comité de la Population had a mission to focus both on raising the birth rate, so by these social policy measures, but also to promote immigration, and I'll come back to this connection in my conclusion. And it gathered politicians and experts, including psychoanalysts, so this is how it came about this in the book. And it was this group that published the Family Code in 1939. So you see again the kind of, this is another quote showing you the kind of promotion of the code. So the Code de la Famille will remain in the history as the greater act ever accomplished in favor of the French family after so many years of individualism, selfishness, Malthusianism, voluntary sterility, and wasting away of family institutions, and a general lack of concern for the future. France gets a hold of herself and shows the world that she too wants to live and will survive. But again, you see the kind of how the family gets associated with the social, right, all the time. Vichy, of course, not only preserved but expanded all this as part of their, since the family was one of the pillars of the national revolution. And again, I'm not going to, there's a lot of really good work on this. Miranda Pollard, Francine Dreyfus, and even Robert Paxton pointed this out, the kind of remarkable continuity of family policy between the Third Republic and Vichy. And what happened basically after the war is that after the liberation is that a lot of the institutions that Vichy had set up, for example, there's one called the Loi Gounod in 1942, which basically sought to institutionalize family corporatism. So it was a way to give family unions, basically. A representation for family associations. So, de Gaulle, in his advice, de Gaulle was an ardent natalist, very concerned with population also. So, you see in the records how they're debating what to do with these laws because they think they're great, but they can't if they're also really associated with Vichy. So they basically republicanize them and rename them, but they're essentially the same. And to this day, the new version of the Loi Gounod is the UNAF, which is basically the Association of Family Groups, Union des Associations Familiales. Okay, so in conclusion, what I wanted to do was actually return to this. What I mentioned, which is this idea that the Haut Comité de la Population was also responsible for setting up a comprehensive immigration policy, because I think it points to the fundamental interconnection of family and immigration, and this is something that Geoff was sort of mentioning already with generation and immigration. And since this is a conference on gender and generation, I think immigration is sort of the other part of this coin, or we could say of family and race. So just as it was specific families that were encouraged to have more babies, only specific immigrant groups were promoted by these policies. And again, this was based on sort of expert demographic words that compared the degree of potential assimilability of different immigrant groups and proposed quotas accordingly. So you can imagine that in the 1930s, Northern Europeans were described as particularly assimilable, whereas Jews and Algerians were much less so. And in some ways, both family and immigration are about reproduction and the reproduction of the nation, right? Both deal with this question of reproduction of the nation. We saw the articulation of family and immigration in the recent gay marriage debates. The Pax, for example, in 1999, the Pax was a civil union law that gave basically civil unions to same-sex or to heterosexual or homosexual couples. They gave all rights that marriage gives except for two: filiation, parent. This is why there's all this drama about the law now, and citizenship. So what I want to do just to end is show you talk about the racist campaign against Christiane Taubira, who's the Minister of Justice, who's a deputy from French Guiana. And before the Mariage pour tous law, she was well known for promoting an extremely controversial law in 2001 that recognized the slave trade and slavery as a crime against humanity. And this was known as the Loi Taubira. And so what was really interesting in these debates is that, you know, she was promoting the law, and she kept on insisting on the kind of republican nature of marriage, that the mariage pour tous was basically the republican extension of marriage, that this is what, and that the children, you know, that this was a law that was basically going to allow the children born in same-sex families to have legal rights, and that this was the kind of republican solution, and that these were, and again, her speeches are really great. You can find them on YouTube. But that these were the children of the Republic of France, right? So she was, as she was Francifying these children, the opponents were racializing her in some way. So these are some of the posters of the filiation, where you see her in the first one kind of cutting down family trees, right, with a chainsaw, and the other one again spanking with a civil code. This is another one of the Manif posters. So again, you see the kind of pretty horrible images. And that's it. So if you think about it, both marriage and immigration are about the reproduction of the nation. If homosexuals are allowed to reproduce, who will be produced through this process? And again, there's a lot of kind of fear under this of the queer child, right? That you're gonna, and there's an obsession with that movie Tomboy, right? That what's going to happen is that what will happen, right, to gender? What will the family look like? And more importantly, what will the nation look like? And of course, this links directly to concerns about immigration, which have been prevalent in France since the 1980s and intensified during the Sarkozy years. Although France has chosen to preserve jus soli, so the right of soil, as the conduit to citizenship, various immigration reforms have significantly complicated this process, leaving jus sanguinis, so filiation, as the most obvious vector of transmission of Frenchness. But in this context, will filiation remain grounded in law according to the system of legitimacy that still, despite all these reforms, underlies the civil code, or will filiation be grounded in biology? And if biology is the primary criterion for belonging to the nation, how will immigrants be forced to integrate into the French nation, to abandon their cultural particularities in favor of the abstraction of France? So I'll just end with that.
So much. Okay, the final historian that we have on our panel today is Professor Becky Conekin, who is a senior lecturer and research fellow at the Macmillan Center and in the history department at Yale University. She also serves as the program coordinator for women's gender and sexuality studies there. And for the decade before arriving at Yale, she taught at the London College of Fashion, University of the Arts. She is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and author of numerous publications, including most recently Lee Miller in Fashion, which came out in 2013 with a big splash. Becky's held many fellowships and visiting professorships at the center, including, I won't read them all, but including at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, also in Cambridge, in Paris, the Center for British Studies, the Humboldt in Berlin, in Illinois, and also in Ann Arbor. Today she will speak with us about, I like her title, From the Delinquent Girl and Car Prostitute of the 1950s to the Troubled Youth and TAMPAPE, can I say it like that? Which is the European Network for HIV, STI Prevention and Health Promotion among Migrant Sex Workers of today. Thanks. Here she is.
Hello. Like everyone on my panel, it seems, I had a book come out this year, and so they seem much more lively than I feel. But, and, it also means that you're seeing a little bit, most of this paper draws on the next book, which I front-loaded because I moved from England to Connecticut about 5 years ago, and I had to leave home at a British Academy to interview women who were professional fashion models from 1947 to 1968. And I was telling the poor woman shoved, oh, she's not here, thank goodness, who was shoved in the car with me this morning, very delightfully, that the main reason I started this project, other than the fact I taught at the London College of Fashion, which was a strange thing that happened to me, was because my head of college kept asking me when I was going to work on fashion, so that was kind of a problem. But also because I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2007 in the autumn, and I was looking at the Lee Miller Centenary exhibition because I was working on her, and next door was this thing called the Golden Age of Couture, and they were projecting this Technicolor newsreel footage of these women who had been professional fashion models. The Technicolor newsreel footage was probably at Dior or something, and these women were walking around these little gold chairs the way they used to. And I said, who are these women? I knew the curator, and she said, oh, we don't really know. I said, pretty sure they're on the cover of Time magazine in 1953, so we could probably figure this out. And she said, well, we put out a call, and somebody's brother-in-law answered, but we don't really know who they are. She said, oh, no, that one. She's kind of a princess now. We know about her. Anyway, this just seemed appalling to me. I just interviewed all these people about Lee Miller, and my first 3 projects, I refused to interview anyone. I was terrified of oral history. I did all these specialist trainings, and it just scared me to death, and I said, I'm never doing that. But I realized I had to. If I was going to work in the 20th century, it was stupid. And so I started doing it, and I met all these fabulous people, introduced me to all these other really interesting people who told me things I would have never, ever found out without interviewing them. And so I thought, this is dumb. These women are possibly alive, and they're probably in their 70s and their 80s, and no one's ever talked to them. And they were on the cover of Time magazine. So I got a lever home in a British Academy, and I've interviewed about, 27 of them, and some editors and some photographers, and partially because I want to figure out how the heck we got from that silhouette to that silhouette in about 5 years. And sociologists so far tell us really silly things about why we were voluptuous, and then we got very thin in a very short period of time. And I think the swinging 60s have a lot to answer for, as does 70s Texas, which is where I grew up, which is why people thought it made sense I was going to work at the London College of Fashion, but it really didn't. Anyway, so there's a little bit about this this next book kind of in this, and then I skip way ahead because I wanted to be relevant to policymakers. So we'll see what happens. Okay, that was a long preamble, I apologize. As various authors have identified across a wide range of fields, in post-war Britain as well as much of post-war Europe, there was a real mood of unease relating to the increase in young women in the workforce and the concomitant opportunities for consumption of a variety of goods and services. These temptations, it was alleged, put young women in moral danger. Of course, anybody who's ever worked on the post-war period knows that, this is all because of cinema and soldiers, and Americans, obviously, are the problem. And we were a problem to some degree. We had, men had nylons and cigarettes and all kinds of temptations. But starting with wartime discourses, of course, we find concerns about the susceptibility of working class girls, especially, to these new popular leisure pursuits and their perceived role in how this is going to lower sexual standards. Right? So one example, for example, is this Girls Growing Up by a very well-meaning and I'm sure lovely woman, Agnes Pearl Jeffcott, published by Faber and Faber in 1942. And this was a study of factory girls. And Jeffcott was incredibly surprised to find how little pleasure and pride these young women took in their factory work. She thought that was just very surprising. And she feared that Hollywood cinema and new cheap women's magazines were feeding them with a fantasy that someday soon their prince would come and carry them away from the drudgery of daily lives. And that was the biggest problem for why they didn't enjoy their work. She wrote, quote, "The girls are desperately anxious for adventure, and they hope for an easier life than which their mothers have led. Their very proper desire to know much more about the new world of love and sex is played upon by these magazines, which feed them with such second-rate food. If the food is low grade, it is only too likely that the mental and spiritual quality of the consumer will be the same. The sex instinct is being overstimulated at precisely the age when this should be avoided." It's true. The new culture of consumption became seen as a difficulty facing women. Their desires could easily get out of control. The pleasures of shopping were perceived as dangerous, a threat to a woman's ability to regulate her own morality and sexuality. And these concerns escalated in the 50s and the 60s. And anyone who's ever worked on Britain or cultural studies knows Mark Abrams' famous 1959 social survey. He's considered the father of social and market research in Britain. He taught at the LSE for a long time. He was at the Brookings Institute. He helped Freud get out of Nazi Vienna. And he wrote this important survey that we all use as a touchstone if you ever work on post-war consumption about the teenage consumer. Do I really have another slide? Oh, this is really unfair. I'm going to let Twiggy on a moped stand in for like the next 10 minutes, which is really incredibly unfair. But I've written about these pictures before, so I have them. And they're funny. And she's slightly dangerous on this stupid moped. It's really funny to me. So, in his critical analysis of the origins of the permissive society, historian of sexuality Geoffrey Weeks has enumerated the major demographic changes in post-war Britain. And Geoff Eley gave us some of these this morning as well. According to Weeks, by 1960, there were, quote, 1 million more unmarried people between the ages of 15 and 24 than there had been only 10 years before, only in Britain. And this is an increase, a 20% increase in the number of young unmarried people in Britain. And on top of that, he tells us, and we all know to some degree, that they wielded a very new and different economic power. Taking even a longer durée into account, Weeks finds that in terms of real wages, there was an increase of 25% between 38 and 58 overall. More importantly, of course, these young people's real wages rose by twice that. And though they disposed of only 5% of total consumer spending, in Weeks' words, they were the biggest purchasers of certain commodities. Exactly as you know, or would you suspect, or you maybe lived through, 42% of record players were consumed by people in this age group, 29% of cosmetics and toiletries, 28% of cinema admission, and so on and so forth. He characterizes this as, quote, a vast new consumer market with an abundance of relatively free income. In addition, the school leaving age, as Geoff Eley told us, was raised first from 14 to 15, and then by the end of the 60s to 16 years of age. And Geoff already pointed to, of course, in Britain and across Europe, the polytechnics happened, the art and design colleges. They're free in Britain. That's where 68 comes from to some degree, other than the LSE and 12 minutes at a hotel in Cambridge. No, I'm teasing. Anyway, so no, but you know, the Who, the Rolling Stones, the mods, fashion, design, graphic design, pop art, all that stuff happens out of these new polytechnic/art and design colleges. The new female consumer and the prostitute were often linked in discussions of sliding standards of female sexual constraint. The female consumer and the prostitute were allied since each emphasized, quote, appearance, adornment, and visible display of both the sexual body with clothes, cosmetics, and perfumes, and the mobile body with travel and involvement in extra-familial pleasures. Of course, the fashion model, I found repeatedly, and they tell me as well, is deeply implicated in all this. Beyond the obvious accentuation of the body on display and modeling, many of my interviewees have mentioned travel as one of their prime pleasures and reasons that they actually kept doing this very hard, low-paid work. A number had also moved from small towns and rural villages in London. In London, these small-town girls reveled in learning the complex modernist grid of the London tube map or the circuitous bus routes of the capital in pursuit of their own dreams. And these young women had to, they become younger and younger, which is something I'm interested in. So you demographers, it is relevant. The school leaving age rises, but they also usually do leave school by 15, 16, and they become models by the age of 17, which is brand new. That's never, ever happened before. They were aristocrats the generation before. They wanted to look 30 even if they were 21, and all of a sudden, everyone wants to look 17 and like a boy, well, like Twiggy, pretty quickly. But they had to go on these go-sees, and they had to have their own bus passes, and they had to figure out how to do this by themselves on almost no money, schlepping all their own stuff and doing all their own hair on the bus. And it's brutal. I mean, they get told like 3 times a day how ugly they are. So anyway. Hopefully you know who these 2 women are. The 2 women at the center of the Profumo affair, which is, of course, a national scandal that rocks the government, the Good Time girls Mandy Rice Davies and Christine Keeler, were portrayed by the court, the newspapers, and subsequently in the Lord Denning's report on the scandal as being worrying, particularly because of their sexual and social class indeterminacy. Quote, their lives were built around mobility, not loitering. They visibly consumed as much as they were consumed. That's what Lord Denning said. Their presence at parties thrown by members of the aristocracy, their affairs with powerful and influential men, their lifestyles of cars, planes, holidays, furs, and jewelry separated them out from other women in a more desirable way than the Whitechapel or common prostitute, Lord Denning said. Rather than tawdry ladies of the night, photographs of them on the front page of the daily papers resembled those of stars and celebrities. And Mandy Rice Davies especially, well, they both were incredibly good at handling the press, and part of the why they came out as the stars of the show rather than what they could have come out as. In a study conducted by ex-superintendent John Gosling and Douglas Warner into Vice in London, published by Popular Press in 1960, so interesting, a Popular Press publishes this this report by actual police into Vice in London, so it's obviously supposed to be salacious, or why else would it be published by the Popular Press? The investigators wrote of a new category of the amateur prostitute. I don't know, she must be paid. I guess she's not a professional, I don't know. She caused the greatest concern because they were very hard for law enforcement to identify, unlike the common prostitute. In a case study of something they called the car prostitute, the authors reported that, quote, there was nothing in her appearance to distinguish her from any of the growing number of women who since the World War had hired cars for a variety of reasons, for an evening at the theater, to drive to a country club, a party, or a premiere. So this woman was terrifying because she looked like other women who wanted to go to the theater, a country club, or a premiere, and yet she was a car prostitute. According to historian Gillian Swanson, the figure of the model, both a term used to refer to Ward's girls, Keeler and Rice, as well as a career aspiration voiced by many, moved across work and leisure, the toiling and the decorative body. As she struck her pose, she linked the work on and with her body to the domain of sexualized and commodified consumption. Much of the anxiety expressed around Keeler and Rice Davies was about their unreadable class status and how they had been artfully constructed. Stephen Ward, the osteopath who was accused of being their pimp, was perceived as making these working class girls into models, starlets, or socialites by teaching them the skills of pose and gesture, elocution, etc., the thing that the British really don't like. If they can't read you by your accent, they're really not very happy about that. An alleged close friend of Ward's said to him in an interview, quote, people were always asking him where he got the girls. He didn't get them, he made them, quote unquote. These anxieties extended to more respectable models as well, and that they themselves have expressed to me over and over again these concerns that people thought they were prostitutes, and people whispered behind their hands when they came into lunch at the right restaurants, etc. Artful construction of their looks and their gestures is what they went to modeling courses to learn, and yet was the thing that actually caused consternation, especially when they fraternized with people of higher classes. The fluidity of the category of the model and the prostitute were illustrated, as I said, by Lord Denning in his report ordered by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan into the perfume scandal. In his report, Denning inferred that Christine's vocation as a prostitute could be clearly read from the newspaper photographs of what he called the missing model. The public display of the female body allowed the reading of her character. And it's seen over and over again that these concerns about my models who really were in vogue and weren't perhaps just call girls. We know they weren't call girls, like these women were who called themselves models. Is this concern that they're the same kind of concerns. They're constructed, we don't know what their class background is, we don't understand them, why do they have those expensive clothes and furs, etc. Denning's assumption that modeling was a euphemism for prostitution was not just a social misunderstanding or an outmoded notion. It elucidates changes in British society in this period in relation to female identities, occupations, and definitions of legitimate sexual exchange. As feminist historians such as Judy Walkowitz and Kathy Pice have illustrated for other historical contexts, dating and treating in post-war Britain and the US were nebulous categories in which it was difficult at times for even the men and women actively engaged in such behaviors to know what sexual or other favors might be expected in such exchanges. And I do have these stories often as well, from both directions. You know, the women saying, why did she think she was at this hotel with these people? You know. Anyway, so I have Cherry Marshall, who was a model in the 40s and took over an agency in '53, and her autobiography states, model agencies and schools had a dubious reputation after the war. Every scandal involving a beautiful girl had the word model in it somewhere. Our reputation was like a seesaw. Up we went with the society girls, and down we went with the call girls, nightclub hostesses, and dollies in the pinup magazines. So with more young women in the workforce in the 50s and 60s, authorities alleged that there was more moral danger. Anxieties mounted about the resulting consumption of this wide array of goods and services. Police fretted over what they perceived to be this casual prostitution. At the other end of the social spectrum, women who worked as models evoked similar anxieties because, as I said, thanks to this tutelage in dress, allocation, posture, elegant makeup, clothes, etc., it was perceived that it was impossible to really know their real class status. It was impossible to place these models properly in the long-established maps of social life in Britain. Undoubtedly, these concerns were exacerbated because, especially in the 50s, a number of these top models did actually marry into the aristocracy. We make a big jump to 1970s Britain. This is, of course, the famous protest of the Miss World contest at the Royal Albert Hall, where they threw flour on the contestants, and the wonderful historian Sally Alexander was there. This is a bad slide of them being escorted out of the Royal Festival Hall. So I think thanks to feminism and identity politics, along with various forms of state liberalization, by 1975 there was an international prostitutes collective in London, housed at the King's Cross Women's Centre, who campaigned to abolish laws against prostitution. And they actually, in one of their big policy statements, talk about the laws in Nevada and how bad it would be for prostitutes to be regulated by the state. They felt that this would criminalize sex workers and their families, both their children, their boyfriends, their partners, etc. And they were worried about that criminalization, and they're very worried about the state intervening. And they also are advocating for higher wages, benefits, and other economic alternatives. So there's an international collective, and by 75 there's also an English version of this collective housed, and it's founded by Selma James, the Marxist feminist black rights advocate, born in Brooklyn in the 30s, but married for 30 years to the West Indian scholar C.L.R. James. And she founded the English part of this at Crossroads Women's Center that then moves to King's Cross, but initially is run in a squat in the red light district in Euston, in the center of London. After weathering decades of schisms and threats of eviction, by 2012, the center is housed in this lush building pretty close to King's Cross still. It has 15 groups, including her dearest project, which was the International Wages for Housework campaign, Women Against Rape, and still the English Collective of Prostitutes meet there. They have indeed said that they're continuing to resist the legislation and state surveillance and the handling of their profession, arguing that the state always meant the police, and thus the harassment and incarceration of prostitutes, their boyfriends, and the threat of removal of their children being taken into care. Jumping to the EU, which I know is the real concern of most people here, we turn briefly to the TAMPEP, I assume we call it TAMPAP, or with some kind of accent, which stands for the Transnational AIDS STI Prevention Among Migrant Prostitutes in Europe project. And it's interesting to me as a historian and also a former AIDS activist in the 80s and 90s to see how the focus and discourse has really shifted, with the prostitutes no longer perceived or represented as predators as we had in 50s Britain, but rather as relatively helpless and exploited victims. It's also, of course, worthy to note that the organization consciously defines itself as transnational, not international, as the UN or Eleanor Roosevelt would have thought of this problem. I mean, that's kind of a linguistic thing, but I think is interesting. Obviously, the phenomenon of HIV/AIDS is a major concern for this organization and its founding, and it's radically changed the terms of debate, even though we have very early UN concerns about venereal disease and prostitution. It's more than that as well, though. I think the idea of prostitutes' rights and the rights of migrant workers is central to this transnational project. For example, one of the many presentation papers produced and prepared by this organization states, quote, TAMPEP as a European project combines research and active intervention with migrant sex workers, sustains that health is defined, taking the subject as a starting point, considering the subject holistically, not only as a body or an organ or as a disease. Health implies an interaction and adequate balance among psycho-emotional, physical, and social factors. It continues, TAMPEP considers migrant prostitutes as subjects of rights, among them the right to health, independently of their legal status, and understands that the work, social, and legal situation of migrant prostitutes has direct consequences for their health situation, unquote. And this is just a bit of their mission statement, which, as you can see, goes on about how it has to be transnational, it has to be about Europe in general, that there's a rise of migrant sex workers. They're very mobile. They're very dubious about the state because they're illegal and they're sex workers. So they often don't seek out any kind of assistance at all, even when they're ill, even if the state would provide it. The major part of this organization is housed in Amsterdam. So, of course, they could have access to all kinds of assistance, but they have to, convince these mostly women, but trans people as well, to trust the state enough to, reach out to it. And so they do exactly what you would anticipate. They have social workers and healthcare workers who go into the areas where these women work, who talk to them and convince them that it is okay to be tested and get assistance if they have STDs or HIV, etc. And they legislate and advocate in ways to help them not to be deported and to get mostly health care. But also, as they said in their statement, they also believe that the emotional life and their kind of terrifying position in society affects their health, and that matters. And then my very tiny last case study is back in the UK, pretty much of today, a report that was released in July 2012. This is an actual image that The Spectator, which is a kind of right-wing magazine, as I'm sure you know, used to illustrate the results of this report. One of many disturbing pictures they chose as an illustration of a report that was, of course, not illustrated, so they chose the pictures. I've been struck by how the young delinquent of the post-war period is now more often defined as troubled youth. And most recently, the UK government, in a report called Listening to Troubled Families, July 2012, defined the troubled youth as a member of the troubled family. And in the introduction to this report, as I said, produced in July 2012, it reads, in December 2010, the Prime Minister set out that he wanted troubled families to be turned around by the end of this Parliament. Okay, that's a goal. The priority was to help families who were struck with many problems, often responsible for causing problems and also costing society a large amount of money in terms of the myriad services that dealt with them without getting to the root causes. Money spent simply containing families in dysfunction and helplessness. A team was established within Department of Communities and Local Government in November 2011 to drive forward as a cross-departmental program to deliver this aim, headed by Louise Casey and under the direction of the Secretary of State. £448 million has been identified across government to fund this program in partnership with all 152 upper-tier local councils who will work with families in their area over the next 3 years. They produced this before 3 years was over, but I guess that's okay. So in the report, Listening to Troubled Families, she writes, Louise Casey herself, it seems, so I assume her team, wrote this sort of topping and tailing of a 64 pages of case studies, which are laid out pretty much like my interviews before I digest them. And they're just kind of like, Liz said, it was upsetting when my father brutalized me at the age of 7 or whatever. And so she says in this report, in the foreword, I wanted to get to know these families. I knew they would have multiple problems, but what would that mean in reality? What kind of problems do they face? How did they get to be so troubled? What came from these family stories were that they had entrenched long-term cycles of suffering problems and causing problems. Their problems were cumulative and had gathered together over a long period of time, perhaps over generations. Listening to the families, there was a strong sense of them having problems and causing problems for years. I don't know, this is written for like a 7-year-old, but anyway. The longevity of their relationship with services was also striking. In many cases, their problems began with their own parents and their parents' parents, in cycles of childhood abuse, violence, and care, which are then replayed in their own lives. Families and its influence, past and present, with a pervading subject of conversation. Anyway, you can imagine this goes on and on about how troubled these families are and how troubling and troubled they have been to, well, obviously the interviewers, but also to the state, social services, etc. There are cycles and cycles of teen pregnancy, abuse, sexual and physical abuse, delinquency, not going to school, not expecting your children to do very much, often alcoholism, depression, etc. I think most of us would find the troubled families troubling, this document troubling in that it's so incredibly othering. I mean, no one middle class has ever had depression, alcoholism, or abuse in their family. Obviously, it's just these families who are a trouble to the state. So I found that very distressing, and I don't really recommend this as bedtime reading. But in conclusion, it's kind of this compassionate sounding conclusion in which it has not been the intention of this report to provide a detailed range of conclusions or recommendations about how services should deal with difficult and troubled families. The report is meant as a starting point to get to a deeper understanding about who these families are and what commonalities or problems they might have, etc. And it's certainly the intention to establish what lies behind some of the darkest aspects of social and familial problems, such as violence and sexual abuse. But what can be established, and perhaps the starkest message to take from these interviews, is the extent to which the problems of these families are linked and reinforcing. They accumulate across the life course, passed on from parents to their children, across generations of the same family. And she's very struck by the fact that these people, even though they have all this dysfunction and abuse, actually are in touch with their family across generations, which also seems to me a very bourgeois idea, that it's so distressing that these people who have problematic relationships still know each other. But anyway, and she wants to get to the basis of this fully dysfunctional family and how to help them. And so she's going to send in more and more social services that are going to talk to them more, and I don't know. As a historian, and more recently, as I said, as one who actually does oral interviews, this is my conclusion, I'm very struck by the oral interviewing methodology of this government team and its resulting report, which is primarily, as I said, this series of case studies just topped and tailed with this kind of, oh, we're so concerned language. I'm also struck as someone living in 2014 in the US and sometimes in the UK by the individualization, I don't know if that's a word, individualization, you know, this is really these families' problems, you know, by the problems and the methodologies in this report. As with so much else, it seems to me, in current US and UK policy, and you guys are the experts, I just read the newspaper, what might have been seen as and conceived as structural inequality in need of something broad-based like welfare policy is now viewed in the UK as specific problems particular to particular families who need more help and support to become functional in their homes, schools, jobs, and society at large, and to stop being a problem, obviously. Given the cycles of violence and sexual and physical abuse that these people in this report revealed, it is clearly true that these individuals do need more support and care from welfare, counseling, and institutions. I'm in no way not saying that. It's just that, however, the shift seems to be decidedly away from concerns about cycles of poverty and unemployment to psychosexual issues, and in some ways that really concern me. And as I said at the start of this short presentation, this is sort of a new venture for me, and all I can offer this morning is some snapshots of how differently past authorities, agencies, organizations have conceived of troubled youth, delinquents, prostitutes, etc. But in all cases, it seems to me that this shift seems toward an understanding of all these people as victims, or potential victims, in terms of their pasts and their presence. In many respects, that sounds like a more compassionate approach, as I said, to the problems they truly, obviously do encounter in their daily lives. But it leaves me, and I think maybe all of us, with the question of what we as academics, and in some cases, I guess your cases, hopefully as real policymakers, really think about discourses of victimhood as the overriding trope coming from most quarters in the 21st century, in Britain and the US anyway, and work that trope does, and is it the most productive way possible? Thank you.
Do I have to actually press this? No, okay. Thank you all for three really provocative papers that I think in important ways kind of complement one another. Now, see, they got to do their work at home, and I have to do my work now, so I have the much harder job, right? I mean, I'm not going to say too much, but just some reactions that I had listening to the three papers, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Well, first of all, I think that there are a lot of complementary themes that emerge here, obviously. We have discussions, for example, of the ways in which the categories we use, as Geoff started, are kind of culturally, discursively made. We also have this question that Becky ended with that has to do primarily with I think the question of social responsibility versus individuals' responsibility within families, and how those categories are created in the different circumstances, right? So Geoff really starts us off with this idea of generation, right, and the post-war settlement in Europe, where we learn that where we know that the future was in some way predictable for this generation of youth. And then he takes us through this very interesting, the logic of the kind of birth of this neoliberal idea, where the post-war settlement, of course, withers away. And then he ends with this idea that where are we now that this post-war settlement has withered away? And of course, we are left with this image of grown children sleeping on the couch, on their parents' couches. And then we move to Camille's paper, so I'm just going to summarize briefly, where she begins very interestingly with this question of gay marriage and why is there so much public outcry about the law on gay marriage in France. And she turns to this very fundamental French notion that the family basically was traditionally understood to solve social problems, so that anything that threatens the family in the way that people perceive gay marriage to threaten the traditional family ultimately will only corrode the republic, right, and will be a problem, a fundamental problem for society, because the family itself, of course, in France is fundamental to Republican ideas. But then everybody ends with this kind of ambiguous question. So we have people sleeping on the couch, kids sleeping on the couch, and here she says, the family is important, but only certain families. So raises at the end, that I'm sure we'll talk about more over the course of the day and tomorrow, this question of immigration, and that only certain families are in any way acceptable or French, or are they French, and do we want to advocate for their preservation? Then we move to post-war Britain, where Becky begins with this question of young women in the workforce, and in post-war Britain, as in post-war France, as in across Europe, that you have increased education, more consumption, and Becky really tackles the question of young women's sexuality and why it is threatening in a variety of ways through her models and prostitutes. And then she also raises another category that weaves its way through all three papers, which of course is class and social class, which we'll talk about today as well. Jumping forward into the 1970s, where we see this international convention or collective for prostitutes. So I was just struck when she said that, because I'm madly thinking, what am I going to say about these papers together? I was just struck by the fact that if we look at Geoff's picture that he creates, where in the 1970s you have this kind of neoliberal encroachment on this post-war ideal, where, to be extremely simplistic, things are looking bad, right? And then all of a sudden you have, of course, like the 1970s, 80s bring all of these kind of rights, political rhetoric. And I think it's interesting. I hope we'll talk about how to reconcile the fact that all of the kind of the feminist movement, gay rights movement, all of these things that also lead to what Becky is describing for us in the 1970s happens against the backdrop of the state's commitment withering away, right? If I got that right. Okay. All right. And then Becky ends with, let me see what I've written down here. Really interesting idea of from this idea of troubled youth at the end, right? And that troubled youth are in some ways more contemporary with the report that she mentions and describes to us, is that troubled youth are all of a sudden imagined as a consequence of troubled families, right? And they're a weight on the state as opposed to a responsibility of the state. Okay, so I'm just restating what they all said, but I think that they do in important ways kind of complement one another. And when we start to think about how from the post-war to where we are today, the role that the state no longer feels that it has to play across Europe and of course in the US as well when it comes to issues of family, gender, generation, and so forth. So this is what I wanted them to do, and they did it, so I thank them very heartily. And now let's go ahead and open it up to questions. What I'll do is collect questions. Is that how you like to do it? Or do you like to do it? I'll go with the Wisconsin way.
I was going to say, please don't feel that you are compelled to make a comment in the form of a question.
Okay, so thank you.
Have to
Comments.
be pushing
or
things
questions.
back
Yeah,
to
you're
the
right.
speakers.
That's right.
But rather picking up what the speakers have given you and running with it in whatever direction
Fair enough.
you see it as stimulating your thinking. So I know in many conferences people feel the need to phrase your idea in the form of a question. Don't worry about it. Comments. That is much more what I'm
Productive.
looking for. And,
Yeah.
and so one of the things that I just wanted to throw in as a comment like that is the issue of this notion of troubled youth that Becky's introduced, and to what extent troubled youth becomes not addressable in Geoff's terms as a collective of a generation because they're situated in some ways in their families. And that somehow or another, rather than the economy defining them or their generational position defining them, they're being addressed in a subject position as the product of a particular way that families function. And if family is then the root of it, then you address things very differently to the family, cross-generationally, rather than to a generation that's facing a contemporary problem, issue, etc. So I thought there was a very interesting contradiction or complementarity in those two frames. Now you've got lots of people who want to comment.
Are we collecting or one at a
No,
time?
we'll
go
let
one at a
people
time.
comment. Nobody
Okay.
has to respond
Okay, so go ahead.
at the moment. It's not a question.
You're right. Okay.
Comments.
Comments. I don't know whether they are questions. For the first presentation, I have the idea, I have the impression that it's a very persuading narrative of what happened, but something is missing. So, for instance, the main missing part is that the so-called post-war social contract was based on the gender division of labor. So it's not that the youth had the same future. Male had one future, women had another future. And actually, the generation of the 68 was not reacting to the coming down of the welfare state or whatever. It was the feminist women, the generation of women, reacting because something had changed for them, education to begin with, and partly the labor market, depending on the country. It was first, in some countries was first the labor market, in other countries was first education. But certainly that particular generation of women was reacting to a future which was too secure and which they did not want any longer, or they were very ambivalent about. So there was the undermining, let's say, of the post-war social contract did not come out only from developments in the market, in the economy, in the neoliberalism, and so on and so forth, but it came out also from at least partial renegotiation of the gender part of that contract. And if you do not put that in, we keep saying that it's only the neoliberal whatever that has destroyed the world that we wanted, which was so beautiful. But actually, there was something which has not been solved, and we now see much more the neoliberal part. But within the neoliberal part, also the gender agreements have been, to some degree, renegotiated. And part of the problem now, I would add, is that the renegotiation of the gender agreement has not been completed, and to some degree has been also redefined and recontextualized because of the other part of the other development. So I would like to be more to see a bit more complexity in your narrative, which otherwise it's only a narrative of what happens in the economy and in the welfare state, as if it were gender neutral. And my second comment is to Corby, yes. It was a beautiful. I know the history of the French family policy, so I knew all the story, but I never realized that the republicanism as a continuity in that story. Very well, very beautiful. It explains a lot of the French case. But then I see the Italian case concerning gay marriages and so on and so forth, or the US case. And you have exactly the same opposition.
No,
Okay.
I disagree.
Certainly in Italy. Certainly, I mean, the same actually is so radical that we cannot even propose a law. It never comes to parliament, a law. Not to say discuss. We have a demonstration in the streets even before you start discussing the law. And it's framed to some degree in the same way without republicanism. That is the family is the basis of society.
It's kind of a big
The family is in nature, in whatever. So what I say is that, is your explanation of the French case an explanation of the way in France argument against gay marriages are framed, while in other countries they are framed in a different way, but they are not really the explanation of why gay marriages are opposed, or why there is such an opposition, because this opposition to gay marriages you find in quite diverse political and cultural contexts. So it cannot be that there is an opposition because family is a Republican issue. That is true for France. But it's more an ex post. It looks to be it's more of a second level explanation, not of an explanation why also in other countries with different political cultures, quite different, you find an opposition. That I'm not opposed, I want to clarify.
You don't say
I'm one
opposed.
of those who would be burned in the squares in Italy, okay. But because I know very well other cases, the Republican explanation is not totally clear to me.
We'll let the panelists have their say and then go back to the audience. Geoff?
Well, obviously I entirely agree, and there's only about the 1970s as a crucible of change in that particular regard, as well as the overall dimension of the gender dimensions of the post-war settlement and of what succeeds it, and the process of contestation that enables that transition to occur. So that I wouldn't say, I wouldn't put it in terms of the state withering away. It is actually dismantled. So the 1960s and 1970s produce a series of conflicts in very much the way that you were reminding us, quite rightly, about, which create fields of political conflict out of which the post-war settlement is kind of pretty effectively confronted and dismantled and destroyed. So it's not an accident that all of those languages of rights and of other forms of collective organization and of claims making are simultaneously being produced, just as the architecture of the post-war settlement is being taken away, right? And that's the main thing. That agreement, but also an amendation of the ways in which we should think about the 1970s, because most of what we think happens in the 60s, in terms of the politics of '68, actually happened in the 1970s, and there's only so much you can do in 15 or 20 years. So most people will probably say that I tried to do too much already. So
You've got a book about it.
I thought there was a lot of complexity in there, actually. I don't.
Yeah, so thank you. I just, I think I should clarify something. What I was trying to argue was not that France was unique in its opposition to gay marriage. I'm quite aware that this is a global phenomenon, at least a phenomenon that's important in Western Europe and in the U.S. So what I was trying to do was to look at the language that was being used in the opposition and make an argument about what that language told us about French political culture. And you might tell me more about the protests in Italy, which I've been following again, but from a distance. But it seems to me that nobody in Italy is parading in a toga or in a or carrying the Roman wolf, right? So the question is, what arguments are being used? So excuse me? Exactly, because of your exactly. So what does this say about Italian nationalism? That's exactly my point. In the U.S. again, the anti-gay marriage movement is not accusing the proponents of gay marriage of not being American. They're accusing them of being sodomites and etc. And the other thing that's very important is that a lot of these countries, in Italy and in the U.S., a lot of this is mediated by religion. The language is religion, and that's very easy. Right? Here, what's interesting to me is that precisely that nobody is using religious arguments. They're not. That's the whole point. Even the Catholic Church is using the social and the symbolic. So that's what's interesting to me. The Catholic Church is obsessed with gender, right? Why not? And again, you could use many arguments against this. They're using, the theology of the body, things like that are actually, social arguments, not grounded in religion, but not disguising religious concerns. So what, again, as a historian, I'm interested in what this tells us that's specific about France in particular, But obviously, I'm not trying to say that France is unique in this case. It is unique, I think, in the arguments it is using. And if other people can, I would love to hear about other examples of where the anti-gay marriage movement has used these kinds of national rhetoric. But it seems to me that, again, religion or just classic right-wingness has provided better arguments in other countries, whereas this in France is using the language of the left. It's the social.
Just a tiny thing you made me think of that is that social science research this year has revealed that Hispanic and African American Catholic women are not anti-gay marriage.
Right.
So once again,
What is interesting is that some of the countries from which adoptive children come usually now are using the nationalist rhetoric to constrain adoption of their own children. So the Turk could say only Muslim, so there is a nationalism which sometimes it's also against the gay adoptive parents. But what I find interesting is the use of nationalism now also for descending countries, not only for the receiving countries. Sorry.
Will I go next? I think we're in a row
Whatever.
here. My name is Mary Daly, and it's nice to meet everybody, and thank you very much for 3 papers, very interesting papers. I have a comment to Becky and maybe comment questions to Geoff. So not so much Becky mentioned this Troubled Families report, and actually I think, Myra, it's Troubled Families rather than Troubled Youth as far as I know. So it's not actually a comment on youth, it's a comment on families as far as I know. But one of the interesting things about that report, which has received huge coverage in the UK, it was based on 8 families. And this is a really serious point about the evidence that's being used for policy making. This has been used really widely in the UK to represent, to actually justify a new program called Troubled Families. And the government has used evidence coming from surveys of poverty to suggest that there are 120,000 troubled families in England alone, I believe, it could be the UK, on absolutely no evidence. And this Louise Casey, who is the czar or czarina of this, is a personal friend of David Cameron's, and she's an entrepreneur, and her company has been involved in selling re-employment services for unemployed young people in England and the UK. So that's just one. There's a really serious point about evidence here. What constitutes evidence? And the evidence in that report is purely anecdotal. There is no methodology section in it, as far as I know, and so forth. So that was just about that. To Geoff, I wonder, I thank you very much for a kind of magisterial overview in many ways. I wonder, was the classic welfare state, as you describe it, was it ever about youth, really? And was it more about older generations? And certainly those of us who do the kind of comparative welfare state studies would be saying that these studies were about really the older, or many of these policies were about the older generation. So I wonder about the representation of the contemporary welfare state as being about abandoning youth. And I would wonder, did the welfare state ever really embrace youth? But there's another point also that I'd like to make, which is again on that point, that if you look at the welfare state today, you could argue that one of the biggest areas of expansion of the welfare state is around children and investment in children. And I know we have differences about how we might define children and youth, but it seems to me there's something there that's worth thinking about in terms of the intergenerational relationships. Thank you.
Can I continue on that?
Keep going, keep going.
Can
That's
you hear
the
me?
idea. Discuss.
Because I had the exact same comment, I think, as Mary, maybe because we were whispering something about this during your presentation, that I thought you maybe overstate how wonderful the post-war settlement years were for the reason that Chiara has talked about, but also overstate how bad it has been in the past few decades. And I'm not going to paint a Pollyannish picture myself, but I do think the sort of representation of what's happening as a sort of gutting of public services and so on overstates what's happened broadly. It may apply better in some cases than others. Coming from the British perspective, one may see that more clearly, but that I think, as Mary has said, if there's been any areas of expansion, it has been in services for children, in childcare, in early childhood education, even in long-term care services. So areas of particular importance to women, to gender relations, there have been changes, not everywhere, not to the place where we all want to go. And if anything, it's the big aspiration now, and it's the EU aspiration, the whole discourse of social investment, trying to learn from the Scandinavian countries and so on, that has filtered through, I think, other countries. And the reforms that have happened in Germany, for instance, along those lines have been very significant and expansionary, even if they're not, we're not at a Nordic nirvana everywhere. But I think it's important to take that into account in your narrative. I have another comment that's not a two-finger, but can I keep going while I have the microphone? I really enjoyed Camille's presentation. One thing on the gay marriage question, I know it's probably not really what you wanted us all to talk about, but we all fixate on it because it is sort of thinking about the future and the future of family, and this is such an important question now across the Atlantic. And I guess the thing that strikes me, I mean, there's the extreme familialist sort of discourse that has come out in France against gay marriage. It's really striking, and I think the roots of it back to this familialism, the Catholic side of it, is, I think, very persuasive. But, one of the big obstacles, I think, to a lot of gay couples in Europe is actually the prohibitions on surrogacy, right, and reproductive technologies. Whereas in the US, the horrible neoliberal place of markets where everything can be bought and sold, That's also something that can be bought and sold and has been enormously helpful for gay men in particular to be able to have children. I just was sitting around at the Council on European Studies meeting with a bunch of gay men who are talking, they're all married now and wanting to have kids, and a lot of them are French or from other parts of Europe, and they're all talking about how they have to stay in the US because the US is where they can have kids. And so there's a whole other sort of line of opposition that seems to come from someplace else. And I'm just curious, in all your research on family and familialism and so on, if you can help explain, because I've always wanted to know, and I think this is something that extends beyond France, it's in a number of European countries, sort of what the roots are of that set of oppositions. Because it's not just a right-wing opposition, it's much broader.
Thank you for the presentations and also for the comments. I kind of agree with most of them, and I kind of want to add something to that, to your presentation first, Geoff. About the First World War, it is often said that it was kind of the gap between the patriarchal family and the post-patriarchal family. And I was wondering whether the Second World War and then the 1950s and 60s, especially the 60s, is then the gap between the husband-centered, marriage-centered family and some other forms. That goes with your segregation of work and family. Because one point is that where youth, as you say, stays home very long, it's usually men. Women move out earlier than men do. And there have been more options for women than there have been for men lately in certain kind of aspects. And so I'm wondering whether behind all those discourses that are there, there is a hidden discourse about the new establishment of maleness, whatever, that we are not really seeing. That also goes with the troubled families that you say. I do not know that report, but then it's youth pregnancy, then it's women, then it's single mothers. You have that kind of discourse, and you've had that for a very, very long time. And I'm not sure how to link that to the gay families, but I think there could be something where the rest of these kind of heterosexual, still male-dominated families are now really on the decline completely. And that this is now really a problem, because the moment you have RRT, and you don't need men anymore, so then they are really losing something very important in the control that they have had over women so far. So this is only a very general and comment.
I'm going to forget some of my responses.
Okay, so let's, can we, excuse me, allow them, and then we'll go to you.
I just don't want to forget
Yeah.
what I've been thinking in response to what has been said. I mean, I really do not want to idealize the post-war settlement. Can I be really clear about that?
He hated them.
And in fact, you know, I came of age politically in the 1960s when the welfare state was consistently the object of radical critique, right? So none of this is a source of difficulty for me. But at the same time, it seems to me, depending on how we, construct our category of the welfare state inside the architecture of the post-war settlement, I mean, it did do all sorts of other things that really did crucially affect the prospects of, like, the formation of youth as a social category and of generation, and of their prospects in the ways that I tried to invite us to think. Free school milk, orange juice, clinic visits. I mean, I grew up in that way too. I was a child of the welfare state in those ways. And I really do accept Carolyn Steedman's very eloquent argument about the ways in which the welfare state produced a validation of children, right? So of course I agree that, we can look at the Beveridge report and the ways in which the welfare state in Britain was instituted after, in the latter stages and aftermath of the war, and say, well, its main emphasis was on older people and on family, of course, and trying to produce a sort of a language and a system of social administrative practice and social policy practice that would put, that would ensure that women were validated as citizens, as mothers rather than as workers, even though, as we know, they've been consistently entering the labor market throughout the 20th century in greater numbers, right? There's always a discordance between between the sociology of the labor market and what, the public culture is asking us to see it as, right? So I accept all pretty much all of the observations that you're making with those, slight amendments. I did want to, to draw a really sharp contrast as a basis for having this kind of conversation. And in my own defense, I did publish this history of the left now 10 years ago, which has a chapter, it has the last part is all about what has succeeded the 1960s, and there is this whole chapter on the regendering of politics, which makes all of these points. So I'm really not trying to diminish the importance of what you've been reminding us about, or to draw too sharp a contrast between the 1950s and the 1960s on the one hand, and the world we're living in now. But I do think there are really important contrasts of the kind that I was trying to emphasize. Doesn't mean that important innovations and initiatives aren't being taken in social policy, and most notably through the mechanisms that the EU provides. And it doesn't mean that there aren't parts of Europe where actually there are relatively progressive kind of social contracts institutionalized. And I believe in some of those accomplishments in Northern Europe very much too. But the world has profoundly changed since the 1960s and the 1970s in the ways that I think we really need to think about, particularly if we're considering generation in those ways.
Can I say something really quickly on the ARTs? Yeah, the two, that's really interesting, and I wrote about this in my book, so it's something I looked into in detail, and at least in the French case, all the discussions of surrogacy and reproductive technologies are framed precisely around what social model this will imply, right? So that somehow, if you allow ARTs and surrogacy, you're because a lot of the people arguing for these rights are arguing on the question of rights or privacy, right? We have a private right to have child. We have the right to have, and the opposition has said the law is not there to give people private rights. It's there to establish normative general frameworks, i.e. the civil code. Right? We don't care what you do in bed. We don't care what you do on the side. But the law cares about who you recognize at the mairie, right? Who you marry, who you recognize as your child. And so you can't establish these kinds of normative principles on the basis of all these individual rights. And so what's really interesting is that the idea around all the controversy in the late 80s, early 90s about reproductive technologies is basically, it pits the side it basically says, if we allow this, we're going to go into this society of pure liberalism, ultra-liberalism, ultra-market, which the U.S. of course doesn't have a problem with, right? But that is seen as a real threat. And what's interesting in that time in France is actually the other reference is, of course, still totalitarianism, right? So we don't want to be totalitarianism. We don't want to be liberalism. We want to be Republican. We want to have the kind of right measure of state and freedom, right? And so back to what Gerda was saying, like all these arguments of like you might not need a man anymore. That was actually Robert Badinter's point in the 90s, late 80s, when he was supporting reproductive technologies for women, and he said, look, at some point you might not need men anymore, and there's a right to have a child. And all these people said, no way, there's no right to have a child. That's precisely not a right. And so kind of a problem of language of rights versus a normative abstraction of law.
Yeah, I just wanted to add very briefly right on to that point, because I was looking at this in Germany, and the ART thing was very much opposed by feminists and the left and the Green Party in ways that Americans found very peculiar. And we do have also a discourse of the left as being, the crunchy granola Birkenstock, back to nature, pro-environment kind of discourse, but it's not dominant in a way that the kind of naturalism of German feminism emphasized. And the very strong European-wide network, FINRAGE, that was a feminist network against violence against women and surrogacy and assisted reproductive technologies, both of which were seen as undermining women's natural power in the family, which they pointed to particularly as being, in part, what the state should go further with in supporting women more. And this comes back to the discussion of Selma James and the Wages for Housework campaign, which took off in Europe, had no resonance in the United States whatsoever. And I think those two things are related. And when we're talking about prostitution, ART, and wages for housework, we have to talk about the social value of women and how are women defined. And I think that's where the ART notion comes in, including a French binary notion of who is a citizen, both women and men, as women and men are citizens. Pearl.
I'm not following up on you, Myra. But
That's okay.
But what strikes me, and that's what's so wonderful about meetings like this, is that we're instructed to look at our own peculiarities. Note, I'm Dutch, so yes, where is the prostitute network? Of course, it's in the Netherlands. But, okay, and we have regulated gay marriage, but they're still terrified about gay men having children. Oh, yes. So, but what strikes me this morning is okay, you're a bunch of historians, so I'm trying to look at continuity and change. And of course, the generation concept was one way to try and get at social change. But the awkward thing with the generation concept is that it's birth cohort. Birth cohort is kind of what influences us when we're growing up. It's also age. And it's and then there's this generation, it's the shared identity. And the interesting thing is that if you look at empirical work that's been done on generations, is that if you ask people, are you a member of a generation? They'll say, oh yeah. And then they think music, they think fashion, they think clothing. So people identify as a generation, but if we look at empirically, are the views of a particular, can we identify the lost generation or the protest generation or the silent generation? We can't as empirical researchers, because then other cleavages are much more important. Cleavages gender and cleavages by social class. So I always run into problems when I'm thinking generation. But I think this split between the identity and whether we can actually establish generations is fascinating. But what I do think we have to look at, if we're trying to adopt policies, is to take that generation as cohort perspective. What were the circumstances under which people grew up? And did they have luck? I mean, if you were in the 70s, you were lucky with the educational expansion, with the just increasing welfare. Right now, kids are out of luck, and I think we have to consider that when we're trying to develop policies. That's one of the continuities and changes that I got, and another is this role of maybe the ideational context, where I find the absence of the religiosity in the French movements absolutely fascinating. But we also know that if we're looking at debates on families, someone had a quote from the 1930s, and then it was individualization. That's what we're saying today, but somehow we've had those weird 1950s, 60s where there was a clamping again on the traditional family, and we forgot about the individualization and the secularization that was very dominant in the 1930s debates, lost in the 1960s, and kind of emerged in the 70s. And that's where Geoff's 1968 generation is so important again, because yes, we have had strong ideational change since the 1970s. So continuity and change, we haven't heard much about the peculiarities of religion and how it works through in the policies in the various countries. So I think we'll come back to that.
Super quickly is that the one thing is that I think in the French case, I think there is no explicit, they're not using explicitly religious arguments, but the religion is there. It's just masked. You know, no, I think, I mean, but that's okay. Again, the interesting question and the interesting difference with other countries of Europe and certainly with the U.S. And Scalia has no problem referring to the scriptures. Nobody's referring to the scriptures here. So why, again, is republicanism a new form of transcendence in some ways that has replaced religion? That is, again.
Has been a very explicit choice by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, but again,
Yeah,
but also,
why?
but it works.
It works.
I agree. Yeah. Of course, but the question is again why it works because of a particular context of secularism, which other countries don't need.
Right.
In France, if somebody came with a Bible, it wouldn't be respected. If someone comes with a civil code, that's a different effect.
My name is Louise Davidson-Schmich. I'm from the University of Miami. And I just have a follow-up comment on what you were talking about in Myra, and then I'll get to my actual comment that I really wanted to make. And that was, I think, I've studied these debates about same-sex marriage and ART in the German case as well. And I think certainly that idea of, you're not German if you're gay or something like that. We don't hear that at all, but because maybe Germans don't want to be Germans.
History, yeah.
But what's interesting is in the German case is how we see the German past and the Nazi past being used in these debates. So one of the justifications for gay marriage is that we discriminated against gays and lesbians in the Holocaust, and so now we have to atone for that by giving people the right to marry. But on the other hand, that's also used against ART because the Nazis did a lot of experiments genetically, and the last thing we want are designer kids. We can't, as Germans, we ethically can't get into that. But my actual first comment that I put up my hand to make goes back to this question that we were talking about earlier, the evidence about, do we base policies on 8 families or 160,000 families? And to go back to something that Geoff said at the beginning, and I think if I understood you correctly, you said, well, we have all these messy social constructions and all sorts of ideas are constructed. And then over here, well, we've got this empirical data that we can draw on and use. And that's not what you were saying. Good. Because what I wanted to say was that I think sometimes the problem with empirical data, especially the kind of data that government policymakers use or that advocacy groups try to use, sometimes it's really difficult. The way we collect data completely masks all sorts of different categories or groups or problems, and it's difficult to establish the need for policies or the needs of certain groups because we don't actually have information about that. So what I'm working on now is a broader project with a group of people looking at minority women in Germany or minority men to some degree, and policy making. And sometimes it's really difficult to establish what the situation are of certain groups because we don't collect statistics about that. So we know about educational attainment of girls and boys, and we know educational attainment of migrants and native-born people, but we can't say what's the educational attainment of a migrant girl or a migrant boy because no one's collecting statistics on this. Nobody's looking at this. If you're a gay family, well, if gay families don't exist and they can't get married, then they can't be counted. So how do we know who they are or what their needs are? So I would encourage any of you who are demographers and can collect data to try to think about how we can try to assess what the needs are of certain groups if we aren't counting them, and maybe they could be counted.
Just in direct response, my point was really about the complicated back and forth between the categories that we use in order to make sense of the world and the actual world that we're trying to describe, which itself is generating, much of that conceptual machinery, right? So it's and I think it's with you know, really salient categories and concepts like class or globalization or whatever. It's getting a handle on that back and forth that's the really interesting thing, I think, for historians, and the really difficult thing for political intervention, because whether it's class or globalization or generation or anything else, it's a category that's really claiming to capture really existing events and things in the world, but is simultaneously trying to shape those events, right? Like the categories that make their appearance both as descriptive ones and as very activist ones, right? So it's not. So I'm not trying to juxtapose some simple juxtaposition of, you know, empirical data that we could construct our categories in order to use, right? I mean, I think it's much more, the back and forth is the thing, and that's, you know, what I wanted to say also in response to your redescription of what I said about, you know, the collection of data that allow us to describe the world vis-a-vis generation, and the purchase that a particular generational identity as a set of understandings has on how many people within that, you know, kind of that within that empirical constituency. And the only thing I wanted to add there is that really, that thinking about generation that really descends from Karl Mannheim and that discourse in the 1920s remains, you know, the most productive way of handling this back and forth, it seems to me. So that generations are actually defined usually in relation to some big event that is big enough in order to, you know, capture, you know, to provide a commonality of experience where people can find themselves, right? And that's what I meant by those two war youth generations and the 1968ers. And the interesting thing is what kind of experience generationally in that way is being generated during the last 25 years for young people now. That's the question that I wanted to end with this morning.